I was fortunate to be able to play baseball all 4 years in college and had a wonderful experience and a great time. And on a lot of levels, I had significant success. My freshman and sophomore year, I struggled significantly, but my junior year and senior year, I had a lot of success and had a ton of fun with baseball. And I remember my freshman year, the fall of my freshman year, I came in and I did really well. And during a winter kind of camp that our graduate assistant was leading with some area coaches, he had me come and help. And he made a passing comment that I don't know if this was trying to light a fire under me or be super encouraging or what it was, but he made a comment about me that I had the potential to be an All-American. Now, this was NAIA. This is not NCAA Division I, so don't get too excited about that. But and so he made that comment. I was never close to being an All-American. I never was even in the consideration, oh, is this person somebody we should consider? No, I was never in that consideration. And part of it is I recognize that I didn't put as much work in as I could have. I didn't lift weights as much as I could have. I didn't take extra ground balls or take batting practice extra like I could have. And so what I'm getting at is I didn't reach my fullest potential. And that was by choice. I had other things that I was doing in college that I was trying to accomplish between work, between my studies. Ended up getting engaged, so that was a huge plus. But so I had other things that I was focusing on that I just didn't divert my attention to that. And so because of that, I didn't reach my fullest potential. Now, I'm not saying I could have been an All-American. I'm not saying I could have played in the major leagues. That's not my point. But I recognize that I reached a certain point, but I could have done better, but I chose not to because there were other things around me that I wanted to accomplish. And as I look about, particularly with baseball, the statistics show us that of all the high school baseball senior players, about 9% make it to college, which I thought was a pretty high number, but there are a lot of different college options. But of the high school baseball players, the senior high school baseball players, 0.5% make it professionally. Now, I thought that was a really high number. That means 1 in 200. And what that means, it's not making it to the major leagues. It's making it to some level where they are paid to play. So making it to the minor leagues. And as I think back of the people I played with, I could probably come up with 1 in 200 that made it to some level of professional play. But the reality is not many make it. Now, when you start going down to middle school and then Little League and T-ball, of the percentage of players that make it to that point, we see some people just are naturally gifted, but a lot of times we are limited because we just don't give of ourselves completely to it. Because we have other things that we are investing in. Not that those other things are bad. When I went to college, hopefully I invested in my education, right? That's something that's why you go to college, right? But because of the other things I invested in, I didn't reach my full potential. And I think sometimes we do that spiritually. Say, well, we got these other things that they're not bad, but we're not going to give of ourselves completely to this. And because of that, we miss out on the potential that God has for us, which means we miss out on the blessing that God wants to put upon us. And so I say all that as we enter into the second half of the story of Gideon in Judges chapter 7. Last week, or 2 weeks ago, we looked at Judges chapter 6, where we have Gideon's calling, where he is this timid, shy, unsure individual, and God comes to him and says, you are a mighty warrior, and I'm going to use you to deliver my people. And then Gideon has some questions, some back and forth. Eventually, they get to the fleece, where Gideon sets out the fleece to test God. So it's an interesting story of God meeting Gideon where he is. But we come to chapter 7, and now it's time to fight. Now it's time to assemble the army. So starting in verse 1, it says, so Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and his army got up early. The armies of Midian were camped north of them. The Lord said to Gideon, you have too many warriors with you. If I let all of you fight the Midianites, the Israelites will boast to me that they saved themselves by their own strength. Therefore, tell the people, Whoever is timid or afraid may leave this mountain and go home. So 22,000 of them went home, leaving only 10,000 who were willing to fight. So Midian at this point had 135,000 troops. That was the size of Midian's army, which is a lot. That's a humongous force. That's a humongous army today, let alone way back then, 3,000 years ago or so. Right? So we're talking about a huge fighting force. It was massive. It was a superpower. Now Gideon had 32,000, which is still a lot of soldiers. And that time point, 32,000 was a really large group as well. But it didn't really match up to the 135,000. Gideon had about 25% compared to the Midianites. Now, there are some speculation that these numbers could be inflated a little bit through tradition. But the key piece to remember is that Midian had a lot more than Israel, to the point where there was really no chance that Israel had against them. Now remember, Gideon, when we learn in chapter 6, he was weak, he was timid, he was afraid, he was unsure, and we see that his army, in a lot of ways, is taking on his personality. There's a lot of fear, there's a lot of uncertainty, but that's what God uses for his purposes. God uses the weak so his power can show up. Gideon was timid, but yet we removed the timid soldiers from the army. And so 22,000 of the 32,000 are removed. So essentially about 70% or so of Gideon's army is completely removed. Said, nope, you're not going to come with us. Now, most versions use the word home. They went home or something of that nature. And it's not as though they left and they went back to their homes and where their family lived. It's more like they went back to their tent, or they went away back to camp or something like that. They just weren't with all of the army, because we find later that the rest of the army comes together with them. Now, when you think about this, there are some practical implications to what was happening here. If you know anything about military units, you know that each unit has to trust each other. That if you have some uncertainty that the person next to you is going to run, that adds a lot of danger to your situation. Right? So if these soldiers are scared, are timid, are fearful, that's kind of a problem. They could be more of a danger to the army than others. They were a liability. And I've always wondered, was Gideon tempted to join them? We talk about he was timid, he was unsure, he was fearful. He sees these 22,000 soldiers, about 70% of his army leaving. He's like, you know what? They probably have the right idea. Maybe I should leave as well. But he doesn't. And the Lord told Gideon in verse 4, are still too many. Bring them down to the spring, and I will test them to determine who will go with you and who will not. When Gideon took his warriors down to the water, the Lord told him, divide the men into two groups. In one group, put all those who cup the water into their hands and lap it up with their tongues like dogs. In the other group, put all those who kneel down and drink with their mouths in the stream. Only 300 of the men drank from their hands. All the others got down on their knees and drank with their mouths in the stream. The Lord told Gideon, with these 300 men, I will rescue you and give you victory over the Midianites. Send all the others home. So Gideon collected the provisions and ram's horns of the other warriors and sent them home, but he kept the 300 men with him. So even though Midian had 135,000, Gideon had 32,000, if Gideon would have went against that army with 32,000, Israel could boast. You know, the odds were terrible, but yet we persevered, we succeeded, we slayed this massive unit. But it's very important that Israel knew that this victory was given by God. Now, they'd been oppressed for 20 years from the Midianites. This was not just a passing oppression that they experienced. It was a long time that they were oppressed. They needed to know it was God. They needed to learn the spiritual lesson first and foremost, because that's what decreasing the army was. It was God providing a spiritual lesson. Because when we claim the credit, what we do is we remove God's glory. We take God out of the equation. It's about me. It's about my abilities. I had the intelligence or the resources or the know-how to do this myself when we take God out of the equation. So God comes and he decreases the army a second time. And this is an interesting test. And there's debate on what was actually happening or why God was testing them in this way. And some of them are pretty intriguing or even comical to think about the theories that they have. But the biggest thing is God was making sure that Israel knew God brought the victory. That is the core of the issue here, that God was limiting them just for his purposes. And so we see the test is if the men would go down and they cup the water with their hands and they drink it, and it says like dogs, which doesn't necessarily sound like an endearing term, but kind of if you refer to a soldier as fighting like a dog, that's kind of a soldier I want to fight next to. Right? That's usually when you call somebody a dog, it's not always a real nice term. But I mean, maybe soldiers are a different breed of people. I don't know. Maybe I'll talk to some of you afterwards. But if a soldier fights like a dog or you're fighting like a dog, sometimes that's the person you want to fight next to. And so on some levels, that may have been what was at stake here. But another theory is that by cupping the water in their hands, they were keeping their eyes up. So they were continually alert. That those who bent down and put their head and drank straight from the water were exposing their neck, which is one of the most vulnerable parts of your body. And armor doesn't really protect that. And they weren't paying attention to anything else. And so they just weren't as aware. They weren't ready. They were putting their guard down. But these 300 soldiers were ready to fight like dogs. And they were not going to take their eye off of anything. They were going to stay focused the whole time. Whether that's exactly what the test means or not, I can't really say, but I think it's an intriguing thing to think about. That too many of us are ready to be unfocused, to do all these other things, or, we'll put our guard down for this or that. But God tests our faith. We don't like it. We don't like tests. Nobody in school is really excited when there's a test, particularly when it's a surprise test. But a test of faith, it strengthens our faith, but it also affirms it. See, if you've studied for the test, you're not intimidated by the test. If you're ready for it, it just affirms that you are ready for it. So God doesn't test us for us to fail. He tests us to strengthen us, and he tests us to affirm us. But we come to this 300. And 300 is less than 1% of the 32,000. So Gideon is going to go fight a force of 135,000 soldiers with less than 1% of his starting army. So at this point, there's no question. If Israel wins, it's clearly God. There's no other way that you could reason your way to some other form of victory. It's God that gives the victory. And as I think about this particular story, I'm reminded and challenged by the concept that God can do more with 300 engaged followers than he can with 32,000 unengaged followers. So the issue is engagement. Regardless of what the test meant, regardless of what was actually happening here, these 300 are engaged. They are fully committing themselves to the mission that God has given them. So as the story continues, that night the Lord said to Gideon, "Get up, go down to the Midianite camp, for I've given you victory over them. But if you are afraid to attack, go down to the camp with your servant Purah. Listen to what the Midianites are saying, and you will be greatly encouraged. Then you will be eager to attack." So Gideon took Purah and went down to the edge of the enemy camp. The armies of Midian, Amalek, and the people of the east had settled in the valley like a swarm of locusts. Their camels were like grains of sand on the seashore, too many to count. Gideon crept up just as a man was telling his companion about a dream. The man said, "I had this dream, and in my dream, a loaf of barley bread came tumbling down into the Midianite camp. It hit a tent, turned it over, and knocked it flat. His companion answered, "Your dream can mean only one thing. God has given Gideon, son of Joash the Israelite, victory over Midian and all its allies." When Gideon heard the dream and its interpretation, he bowed and worshipped before the Lord. Then he returned to the Israelite camp and shouted, "Get up, for the Lord has given you victory over the Midianite hordes." So in chapter 6, there are several times that God comes to Gideon to provide assurance. The first thing that is said to Gideon, "You mighty warrior." And then time and time again, God affirms Gideon. We see with the fleeces that Gideon puts out, that Gideon sets some tests, and God comes to assure Gideon, said, "Yes, I am with you. I am helping you." God continually affirms Gideon. And one of the blessings of that is that we're reminded that God meets us where we are. Gideon is timid. He's full of fear. He's uncertain. God knows Gideon's personality. And at this point, God has done so many things to let Gideon know that God is with him, that God is taking care of him, that God has promised victory. God doesn't really have to do anything else. But yet, he gives him one more moment of assurance. Because God meets us where we are. He knows what we're going through. And I personally think at this point, Gideon had all he needed, but God gave him more. Sometimes I think we say, well, God gives us just the bare minimum. Well, that's not how God works. God's not like rationing his grace because he might run out. And I believe there are many, many times where God gives us more grace than what we actually need to accomplish the task. But he does that just to give us assurance, just to give us extra confidence, just so we can know that he's got this. And that's what he's doing with Gideon. But there's something that happens here that we'll talk about next week a little bit, but I want to give you a little preview of this. This moment is the last moment that God is mentioned in Gideon's story in which God is an active participant in Gideon's life. Gideon's story doesn't end in chapter 7. It continues. And Gideon is kind of like the fulcrum, the tipping point in the book of Judges. I've mentioned before several times that the book of Judges gets worse and worse and worse and worse. And man, we like to stop with Gideon's story at chapter 7. Or chapter 7, verse 25 is where we like to stop. But we see that God is going to be removed from Gideon's story after this point. And so as we continue into Israel's story, we see that God is more and more absent from them, and the people get worse and worse and worse. It's about God's presence that we need. It's about more of God. It's not about our abilities, which Gideon gets kind of in his head a little bit. And I kind of gave you more than what I bargained for on that one. But we see how when we take God out of the equation, bad things happen. But as Gideon trusts God in this moment, he goes to the Midianite camp, and he's first and foremost reminded of the size of the army. You know, too many to count, like hordes of locusts. They're everywhere. But he still goes. He still has confidence. But as I think about what God has done with Gideon's army, God did not reduce Gideon's army in order for God to work. The size of Gideon's army made no difference to God. It wasn't like, oh, we got 300. Okay, that's where God needs it. This was about the spiritual needs of Israel. Had nothing to do with God, because God could have given Israel victory with the 32,000. He could have given victory to Israel with the 10,000. You know, we come to the book of story of Samuel, and we see God can give victory with one. It didn't matter the number. The number was for Israel. It wasn't about God. God reduces the number to show Israel, to remind Israel, to teach Israel that they need God. Because God can do more with 300 engaged followers than he can with 32,000 unengaged followers. It's about the people, our engagement, our willingness to commit to him. So Gideon goes and he gets this prophetic dream, or hears this prophetic dream, which shows the mentality of the Midianites. That they have 4 times the amount of soldiers that Gideon does. but yet they know Gideon has something they don't. I think that they recognize that Gideon has some type of power behind him that Midian and Amalek and the other people of the east don't really necessarily have. And so they believe with this dream that Gideon is going to win. That's their mentality. And sometimes when you know that you're defeated, you're already defeated. So Midian knew they were defeated because God had won. But the story ends, or the story concludes with a battle here. We see in verse 16, Gideon divided the 300 men into 3 groups and gave each man a ram's horn and a clay jar with a torch in it. Then he said to them, "Keep your eyes on me. When I come to the edge of the camp, do just as I do. As soon as I and those with me blow the ram's horn, blow your horns too, and all around the entire camp, and shout for the Lord and for Gideon." It was just after midnight, after the changing of the guard, when Gideon and the 100 men reached the edge of the Midianite camp. Suddenly, they blew the ram's horns and broke their clay jars. Then all 3 groups blew their ram's horns and broke their jars. They held the blazing torches in their left hands and the horns in their right hands, and they all shouted, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." Each man stood at his position around the camp and watched as the Midianites rushed around in panic, shouting as they ran to escape. When the 300 Israelites blew the ram's horns, the Lord caused the warriors in the camp to fight against each other with their swords. Those who were not killed fled. Then Gideon sent word to the warriors of Naphtali, Asher and Manasseh, who joined in chasing the army of Midian. Gideon also sent messengers throughout the hill country of Ephraim, saying, "Come down to attack the Midianites. Cut them off at the shallow crossing of the Jordan River." So all the men of Ephraim did as they were told. So there are 3 groups. They have 300 men, 3 groups of 100 each. They have a ram's horn, a clay jar, and a torch. It was midnight, so it was dark. Remember, they don't have like street lights, or there's no like light pollution like we have today. Like, it was dark. They surround the Midianite army. And now they didn't have the New Testament at this time. Some of you may have been part of services. For some reason, we really like to do this to youth, where we had this real intense end times sermon. And then at the conclusion, when you're trying to get the altar call, you had someone in the back blow a trumpet really loud, right? Some of you probably have been a part of those, or at least heard those experiences and how terrifying it was. I've heard stories where people were like pushing each other over to get to the altar because they heard the horn, right? We can kind of laugh at it, but it's kind of terrible at the same time. But the horn is kind of terrifying at midnight. People are being woken up to this. The Midianites are sleeping, and all these horns are surrounding them. Now, the timing was kind of important as well. At midnight is when this happened, and the night was separated into 3 different watches of 4 hours. So the first one started at 8, the second one started at midnight, the third one started at 4 a.m. And so at each one, you would have a switch. And so at midnight, we'd have the people that started at 8. They would be, a third of the soldiers would be walking back to their tents to get some sleep, while a third of the soldiers would be waking up to go take their position to guard the camp, while the other third was trying to soundly sleep. And so at midnight, all these horns are going off, all of these jars are being broken, all these torches are being lit, and all these, they're hearing these cries from these warriors, and so there's panic that's happening. So, I mean, I don't know about you, but if I get woken up in the middle of the night, I'm not particularly coherent. Right? And so if I wake up to a loud sound, to a light, to things crashing, and to people screaming, I'm gonna panic. And so the Midianites wake up to this panicking. And so there's the third that's coming back, and so the third that's waking up and that's just still sleeping are woken up to this crashing and this yelling and these horns, and they see this third of the army coming back, and they say, they're being under attack. And so the army devours themselves. And there's panic. Now remember, there were the Midianites the Amalekites, and then the other people of the east. So they probably didn't have uniformity with their uniforms. They didn't have the same equipment. They might not have all spoken the same language. And so there was some confusion in general with those types of obstacles. But Gideon and the 300 men, the timing may have been perfect. It may have been advantageous for this. But you know what? They still had to stand there. That could have been a very terrifying experience. There's 300 of them and 135,000 Midianite soldiers. And they had to stand there surrounding the camp, knowing that if the Midianites came after them, they didn't stand a chance. They stood there, they stood their ground, and they continued to do what they were told to do. Because you know what? God can do more with 300 engaged followers than he can with 32,000 unengaged followers. And when all this is happening, after the panic is underway and they start fleeing, that's when Gideon calls the other soldiers, the other 31,700 of, hey, let's go, Naphtali, Asher, Manasseh. And then he calls Ephraim and says, let's go, let's finish this off. And they chase them, and they do. The 300 were instrumental in this, but they couldn't necessarily do it alone. They needed the help of others, because remember, this is all about God's plan. See, God doesn't work in spite of our weaknesses. I think that's sometimes that's how we phrase it. Well, God works in spite of my weaknesses. No, God works through my weaknesses. It's not that God says, oh man, you don't have it, but you know what? I'll figure it out. He says, Jeff, you're the one I want. Don't worry about what limitations you think you have. God says, I got this covered. It's you I want, regardless of what you have to offer. So God doesn't care what you have to offer. He just wants you. And he doesn't work in spite of your weaknesses. He works through your weaknesses. He knows your weaknesses, and he knows how to accomplish his purposes, regardless of what strengths or weaknesses you have. Now, Gideon's story in chapter 6 of the book of Judges begins with him threshing wheat in the wine press. Remember, threshing wheat, that was a kind of a sunken-in pit, and he was doing this to hide so the Midianites wouldn't come and steal his grain. He was doing it in a low place so that he could kind of throw the wheat in the air to separate the good from the bad in a way that wouldn't be noticed so that he could keep it and the Midianites wouldn't come. It shows he is timid, he is scared, he is unsure. That's how his story begins. But the story at the Midianites ends by him chasing after them, by him having victory, by him pursuing the Midianites in victory that God has given us. See, I'm reminded that God doesn't need us. There's nothing about me that I can offer to God that says, oh my goodness, that's what I need. I don't have gifts or talents or skills or resources that if I don't give them to God, God says, I just don't know what I'm going to do without you, Jeff. God never has that God doesn't need me, but yet God chooses me. He chooses to work through his people. God could have used one. He used 300. He could have used 32,000. The number wasn't important, but God doesn't need us, but he chooses us. He chooses our freedoms, our actions to achieve his purposes. As humans, we are called to be active participants in the plans that God has. He invites us into his plan. But it's not about me. It's about being engaged with what God is doing, because God can do more with 300 engaged followers than he can with 32,000 unengaged followers. But what if we, as I was thinking about the different tiers here, the different numbers, I'm wondering if this is really indicative of the church. Because there are 32,000 that Gideon starts with. What if 70% of the church is like that 22,000? You know what? They're there. They had the uniform on. They put on their Sunday best. They are present. You know, they may sing a little bit. They say they're part of the group. But you know, when push comes to shove, they're just going to go somewhere else. You know, if something else better comes up, If we got a family event, if there's a football game, if I just want to sleep in, I'm just not going to participate. Now, what about the 10,000? I think the 10,000 can be real difficult, or the 9,700, is because they're the ones, they're willing to work. They're not scared. They know the consequences of the battle. They're willing to work. But I wonder if the 9,700 is representative of my efforts in college. I had success. I put in some effort. But you know what? I had a lot of other things that I was focusing on as well. See, I bet those 300 were laser focused. That they knew the consequence. They worked just as hard as the 9,700, but they had nothing else that they were worrying about but this mission that God had given them. And I wonder how many people in the church are content with being the 9,700 or the 22,000. I just want to be part of the club. Or, you know what, I'll work as long as I don't have to compromise over here. I still want to keep these interests over here. If this comes up, this is important. I can't always neglect this. But when you break down the percentage, 300 was less than 0.1% of the 32,000. Now, I don't necessarily think this is true, but it could be. Is there just 0.1% of the church that's fully sold out to Jesus? I think too many times we assume we're the 300 when we're not. I think we have to be real careful because we can slip into that 9,700 or the 22,000 real easily. But the issue is not that you work harder, it's that you give this other stuff up. And that's a real important distinction because I think the 9,700 is so focused on working harder that they forget about giving the right things up. That's a really important distinction because the 22,000 probably do stuff. They probably make effort. 9,700 is we're doing the real work. We're making real sacrifices. We're bearing the real burden. Now, that's pretty self-righteous if we're not careful about it. See, the call to holiness is not a call to do more. It's the call to come closer to Jesus. That's what the call to holiness is, and that's what I believe is the 300. They said, you know what? There are other opportunities here. And they may not be bad, but if I pursue them, I'm not going to be pursuing Jesus with the same veracity that he calls me to pursue him.